Harold Wilson's calloused hands trembled as he opened the letter from the bank. Another final notice. His four-generation family farm was now just 30 days from foreclosure. He crumpled the paper and tossed it aside, then noticed a small boy standing at the edge of his property, clutching a broken toy tractor and crying silently. Harold didn't know that fixing this simple toy would lead to a contract worth millions, or that the boy's parents owned Magi Toys, the largest toy company in the world. He didn't know this random act of kindness would save his farm and spark a movement celebrating the forgotten values of rural America. But as he called out to the boy, offering to help, one question remained. Could a simple farmer's genuine heart touch the world in ways his struggling crops never could? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The summer heat pressed down on Oak Ridge Valley like a heavy blanket, shimmering across the parched fields of Harold Wilson's farm. At 58, Harold's weathered face told the story of decades spent battling the elements, the market, and increasingly, the banks. His once prosperous 200 acres had dwindled to barely 80. The rest sold off piece by piece to keep the remainder afloat. That morning, like every morning for the past 40 years, Harold rose before the sun. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who knew exactly how much energy he had to expend each day, no more and no less. The arthritis in his knees had worsened over the last harvest season, but he refused to acknowledge it beyond the occasional wince when rising from his crouch to check the irrigation lines. The farmhouse kitchen remained largely unchanged, since his late wife Margaret had decorated it in the early 90s. Faded yellow curtains with a pattern of small daisies hung limply in the window above the sink. The refrigerator hummed laboriously, fighting against both age and the oppressive heat. Harold prepared his breakfast methodically: 2 eggs from his remaining chickens, a slice of toast, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. As he ate, Harold reviewed his mental checklist for the day. The western field needed attention. The irrigation system was failing again, and he had to make a decision about whether to repair the tractor or finally admit defeat and sell it for parts. Each option required money he didn't have. The mail truck's distinctive rumble pulled him from his thoughts. Harold knew what awaited him: bills, notices, and likely another letter from Mid-State Bank regarding his delinquent mortgage. The payments had become insurmountable 3 months ago, when the last of his savings had gone toward emergency medical bills after he'd thrown his back out during planting season. Harold set his coffee mug in the sink and walked outside, squinting against the already fierce morning sun. The red flag on his mailbox stood upright, a soldier bearing bad news. He pulled out the stack of envelopes, thumbing through them without opening any. His eyes caught the Mid-State Bank logo on the thickest envelope. No need to open that one immediately. Its contents would only confirm what he already knew. Back inside, he tossed the mail onto the kitchen table and stared out the window at his land. The corn wasn't doing well this year, and the soybeans looked even worse. A decade of increasingly unpredictable weather patterns had made farming more challenging than ever. Last year's drought had been followed by this year's early flood, which had wiped out nearly a third of his initial planting. Insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. With a deep sigh, Harold picked up the bank envelope. Might as well face the music. The letter inside was printed on heavy paper, embossed with the bank's logo at the top. The language was formal, but unmistakable. He had 30 days to bring his mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. The sum required made his stomach tighten: $24,873.42. $24,000, he muttered to the empty kitchen. The amount might as well have been $24 million. Even if he sold everything he owned, including his late father's watch and his mother's wedding ring, he wouldn't come close. Harold crumpled the letter in his fist, the crisp paper crushing satisfyingly in his palm. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the anger, the unfairness of it all. His family had farmed this land since 1932, when his grandfather had purchased it during the depths of the Great Depression. They'd survived that economic catastrophe, the Dust Bowl, the farm crisis of the 1980s, and countless other challenges. But this might be the end of the line. He tossed the crumpled letter onto the table and headed for the door. Work wouldn't wait, regardless of what the bank said. The world kept turning, crops kept growing or failing, and animals needed tending. Harold had learned long ago that rhythm was what kept a farm, and a farmer, going. Disrupt the rhythm, and everything fell apart. Outside, the heat hit him like a physical force. Already pushing 90 degrees, and it wasn't yet 9 in the morning. Harold headed toward the barn, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The land was too dry. Despite the irrigation system, he could barely afford to keep running. As he approached the barn, he noticed a small figure standing at the fence line where his property bordered the county road. A child, it seemed, though Harold couldn't make out much more from this distance. Visitors were rare out here, 5 miles from the nearest town and well off the main highway. Harold changed direction, curious. As he drew closer, he could see it was a boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with sandy blonde hair and wearing blue overalls that reminded Harold of his own childhood. The boy was clutching something to his chest and appeared to be crying, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Hello there," Harold called out, still some distance away to avoid startling the child. "You all right, son?" The boy looked up, startled despite Harold's precaution. His face was tear-streaked, and his eyes were red and puffy. He clutched the object in his hands more tightly. "I'm sorry," the boy said, his voice small and wobbly. "I didn't mean to trespass." Harold reached the fence and rested his arms on the top rail, deliberately making himself less imposing by leaning down. "You're not trespassing. Just wondering if you need some help. Are you lost?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. We're staying at my aunt's house in town. For the summer." He looked down at the object in his hands, and fresh tears welled in his eyes. "But my tractor broke, and Mom and Dad are busy, and Aunt Jenny doesn't know how to fix things." Harold now saw that the boy was holding a toy tractor, and quite an impressive one at that. It appeared to be a detailed model of a John Deere, about a foot long, with moving parts in considerable detail. One of the front wheels hung at an odd angle, clearly broken off its axle, and the small driver's cab was cracked. "That's a mighty fine tractor you've got there," Harold said, nodding appreciatively. "Mind if I take a look at it?" The boy hesitated, then extended his arms, offering the broken toy. Harold carefully took it, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was excellent, with details he wouldn't have expected in a child's toy. The tiny hydraulics for the bucket actually moved, and the tires had real rubber treads. This was no cheap plastic toy from a department store. "What's your name, son?" Harold asked as he examined the damaged wheel. "Jacob," the boy said, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Jacob Matthews." "Well, Jacob Matthews, I'm Harold Wilson. This is my farm you're looking at." He gestured with one hand toward the expanse of fields behind him. "And I think I might be able to fix this tractor for you." Jacob's eyes widened. "Really? You can fix it?" Harold nodded, already mentally inventorying the parts he might need. The axle was bent, and a piece of the plastic housing had broken off. "Nothing too complicated." "I believe so. I've fixed a few real tractors in my time. This little one shouldn't be too much trouble. How much will it cost?" Jacob asked, his voice suddenly worried. "I have $3.27. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled handful of bills and coins. The sight of the boy's small hand offering his meager savings made something twist in Harold's chest. He shook his head firmly. "Put your money away, son. No charge for neighbors helping neighbors." Jacob's face lit up with such pure joy that Harold felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. When was the last time he'd made someone that happy? "Tell you what," Harold said. "How about you come back tomorrow afternoon? Say around 2 o'clock. I should have it fixed up by then." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Jacob bounced on his toes, his earlier tears completely forgotten. "I'll tell my aunt to bring me back tomorrow at 2 o'clock exactly." Harold smiled, the expression feeling almost foreign on his face. "You do that. And be careful heading back to town." Jacob nodded vigorously, then turned and ran down the road, occasionally looking back and waving. Harold watched him go, the broken toy tractor still in his hands. For a moment, he stood there, The weight of the bank letter temporarily lifted from his shoulders. Back in his workshop, a small space attached to the barn that had once been his father's domain, Harold set the toy tractor on his workbench. The wooden surface was scarred with decades of projects, repairs, and improvised solutions. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, many of them inherited from his father and grandfather. Some modern tools had joined the collection over the years, but Harold still preferred the feel of the older ones, their handles worn smooth by generations of Wilson hands. He pulled the chain on the overhead light, illuminating the workspace. The toy tractor looked incongruously small and colorful among the serious implements and machinery parts that usually occupied the bench. Harold pulled up his stool and examined the damage more carefully. The front axle was indeed bent, probably from being dropped or stepped on. The plastic housing around the driver's cabin had a crack running along one side, and a small piece had broken off completely. Harold searched through the various containers of screws, washers, and random small parts that lined the shelves above his workbench. He found a metal rod that could serve as a new axle, slightly thicker than the original, but workable. For the plastic housing, he'd need to use epoxy to reattach the broken piece and reinforce the crack. He had some left from repairing the irrigation pipes last month. As he worked, Harold found himself taking more care than the simple repair actually required. He could have bent the axle back into approximate shape and glued the plastic piece haphazardly, and the boy probably wouldn't have noticed the difference. Instead, he carefully cut the metal rod to the exact length needed, filed the ends smooth, and made sure the wheels aligned perfectly. For the plastic housing, he cleaned both surfaces meticulously before applying the epoxy, holding the pieces together with small clamps while the adhesive set. When that was done, he noticed that the toy was dirty, with mud caked in the tire treads and dust dulling the bright green and yellow paint. Harold gently cleaned every surface, using a small brush to get into the detailed parts. As the afternoon light slanted through the workshop windows, Harold stepped back to admire his work. The repaired tractor looked almost new. The metal rod he'd used for the axle actually stronger than the original. The epoxy had dried clear, and unless you knew exactly where to look, you couldn't see the repair to the cabin. Harold felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in months, maybe years. This small accomplishment, fixing a child's toy, had provided more immediate gratification than the endless, often fruitless labor of trying to keep his farm afloat. He carefully placed the repaired tractor on a shelf, ready for Jacob's return the next day. Then he turned his attention back to his real-world problems. The irrigation system still needed work, and the actual tractor, a 30-year-old John Deere that had seen better days, was making an ominous knocking sound whenever he started it up. That night, Harold sat on his porch as the sun set, casting long shadows across his fields. The evening brought little relief from the heat, but he preferred being outside to sitting in the empty house. A glass of iced tea sweated on the small table beside his chair. In the distance, he could see his nearest neighbor's lights come on, nearly a mile away. The isolation had never bothered him when Margaret was alive. They'd been enough for each other, comfortable in their shared silence and occasional conversations. Since her passing 5 years ago from breast cancer that had gone undetected too long, the solitude had taken on a different quality. Some days, Harold would realize he hadn't spoken aloud to another human being in over a week. His thoughts drifted to the boy, Jacob, and his broken toy. Such a small thing to bring such genuine joy. Children were like that, though, weren't they? Uncomplicated in their happiness and sorrows. Harold and Margaret had never had children of their own. Not for lack of trying, but sometimes life had other plans. Margaret had suffered 3 miscarriages before the doctors advised against trying again. They'd discussed adoption, but somehow the years had slipped by, always with the next season to prepare for, the next crisis to weather. And then, it had been too late. Margaret diagnosed with stage 4 cancer that took her within months. Harold sipped his tea, letting the memories wash over him without fighting them. Tomorrow, he would see the boy's face light up when he handed over the repaired tractor. It was a small thing, but right now, it felt important. The next day dawned even hotter than the one before. Harold spent the morning on necessary repairs to the irrigation system, replacing cracked sections of pipe and clearing clogged nozzles. By noon, his shirt was soaked through with sweat, and his back ached fiercely. He returned to the house for a quick lunch and to clean up before Jacob arrived. The boy had said 2 o'clock, and Harold wanted to be ready. He washed his hands and face, changed into a fresh shirt, and even combed his thinning gray hair. At 1:45, Harold retrieved the repaired toy tractor from the workshop and carried it out to the front porch. He settled into his chair to wait, the toy resting on the small table beside him. As the minutes ticked by, Harold found himself surprisingly nervous. Would the boy be pleased with the repair? Would the axle hold up to play? Had he missed anything? At 5 minutes past 2, Harold heard a car approaching. An older model sedan pulled up to his gate, and Jacob burst out of the back seat almost before the vehicle had come to a complete stop. A woman, presumably his aunt, called something after him, but the boy was already racing up the driveway toward the porch. Harold stood, picking up the repaired tractor. Jacob skidded to a halt at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly shy. "Hello, Mr. Wilson," he said formally, as if remembering manners he'd been taught. "Hello, Jacob," Harold replied, equally formal. Then he held out the toy tractor. "I believe this belongs to you." Jacob's eyes widened as he took the tractor. He turned it over in his hands, examining every detail. The wheels spun freely, the axle holding firm. The repaired cabin showed barely any sign of the damage. The clean, shining surfaces gleamed in the sunlight. "You fixed it," Jacob whispered, awe in his voice. "It looks even better than before." "Just needed a little attention," Harold said, trying to sound casual despite the warmth spreading through his chest at the boy's reaction. "That's a mighty fine tractor you've got there. Must be special to you." Jacob nodded vigorously. "My dad got it for me. It's exactly like the tractors they make in the factories." He looked up at Harold, his eyes shining. "My dad designs toys. He made this one specially for me." "Is that so?" Harold said, impressed. "Well, he does fine work." The car horn honked gently, and Harold looked over to see the woman gesturing for Jacob to hurry up. "I gotta go," Jacob said, clutching the tractor to his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thank you so much." "You're welcome, son. You take care of that tractor now." Jacob nodded again, then turned and ran back to the car, holding the toy carefully despite his haste. Harold watched as the boy climbed into the back seat, immediately showing the repaired tractor to his aunt. The woman looked up and waved at Harold, who returned the gesture. Then the car pulled away, kicking up a small cloud of dust as it disappeared down the road. Harold stood on his porch for a long moment after they'd gone, feeling oddly lighter than he had in months. It was a small thing, fixing a toy for a child, but it had provided a purpose and satisfaction that had been missing from his life for too long. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks. Harold checked on his crops, tended to his small herd of cattle, and made a list of supplies he needed to purchase in town. The bank letter remained on his kitchen table, a looming presence he couldn't quite bring himself to face again. That evening, as Harold prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and a sandwich, he heard another vehicle approaching. This was unusual. 2 visitors in one day was practically a social whirlwind for his isolated farm. He stepped onto the porch just as a gleaming black SUV with rental car plates pulled up to his gate. A man and woman emerged from the vehicle. They were both in their early 40s, dressed in casual but clearly expensive clothing. The man wore designer jeans and a polo shirt, while the woman had on white capri pants and a flowing blue blouse. They approached the gate with purpose, the man carrying what appeared to be a leather portfolio. "Mr. Wilson?" the man called out. "Harold Wilson?" "That's me," Harold replied cautiously, walking down the porch steps. "Can I help you folks?" The couple exchanged a glance, and then the man spoke again. "My name is Robert Matthews, and this is my wife, Claire. We're Jacob's parents." Understanding dawned. Ah, Jacob's parents. He mentioned his father designs toys. Harold reached the gate and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you." Robert shook his hand firmly. "We wanted to thank you personally for fixing Jacob's tractor. He hasn't stopped talking about it since he got back to his aunt's house. Claire nodded, her smile warm. It might seem like a small thing to you, but that tractor is very special to Jacob. It was a prototype I designed specifically for him, Robert explained. There are only 3 in existence. Harold raised his eyebrows, impressed despite himself. Well, it's a fine piece of work. Detailed, too. Much nicer than the toys I had as a boy. May we come in? Claire asked. We'd like to talk to you about something. Curious now, Harold opened the gate. Of course. Sorry about the state of things. Don't get many visitors out this way. He led them up to the porch, quickly clearing off the extra chairs he normally used to hold tools or the occasional basket of vegetables. The couple sat down, and Harold offered them iced tea, which they accepted gratefully. When he returned with the drinks, Robert had opened his portfolio and was removing some papers. Harold felt a flicker of unease. In his experience, people with portfolios and papers usually brought bad news. Mr. Wilson, Robert began. I don't know if Jacob mentioned this, but I'm not just a toy designer. I'm the CEO of Magi Toys Corporation. Harold nearly choked on his tea. Magi Toys was one of the largest toy companies in the world. Even someone as disconnected from consumer culture as Harold had heard of them. And I'm the chief creative officer, Claire added. We founded the company together 15 years ago. That's impressive, Harold managed, wondering why these important people were sitting on his worn-out porch. But I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Robert leaned forward, his expression earnest. When Jacob came home with his repaired tractor, he couldn't stop talking about the kind farmer who fixed it. He described how carefully you explained what you were doing, how you refused to take his money, and how you made it better than new. Claire picked up the thread. We were touched by your kindness. In our world, Mr. Wilson, genuine actions without expectation of return are increasingly rare. Harold shifted uncomfortably. It was nothing, really. Just being neighborly. It wasn't nothing to Jacob, Robert said firmly. And it isn't nothing to us. He placed some photographs on the table between them. These are some of the toys we've developed over the years. Our company specializes in educational toys that teach children about different professions and lifestyles. Harold examined the photos. They showed various toy sets, a veterinary clinic, a space station, a construction site. Each was detailed and realistic, clearly designed with care. Our most successful line has been our Community Heroes series, Claire explained. Firefighters, doctors, teachers. But we've been wanting to expand into something new, something that helps urban children understand where their food comes from and the value of agricultural work. Robert nodded. We've been developing a farm playset for over a year, but something has been missing. The heart of it, the story behind it, wasn't quite right. Harold looked between them, still not understanding where this conversation was heading. I'm afraid I don't follow. Robert smiled. Mr. Wilson, we believe that what happened between you and Jacob contains exactly the spirit we've been trying to capture. A farmer, despite his own troubles, taking the time to help a child, to teach him the value of careful work and community support. We'd like to base our new Wilson family farm playset on your farm, Claire said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. And we'd like to feature your story in a children's book that will accompany the toy line. Harold stared at them, certain he had misheard. My farm? A toy? Robert nodded, pulling out more papers from his portfolio. We would pay you a licensing fee up front, plus royalties on every set sold. And we'd like to feature real images of your farm in our promotional materials, which would mean an additional fee for photography rights. Harold's mind was spinning. I don't understand. My farm is failing. The bank is about to foreclose. Why would you want to model a toy after it? The couple exchanged another glance, and Claire spoke gently. Mr. Wilson, it's not about the economic success of your farm. It's about the values it represents. Hard work, perseverance, community, kindness. These are the values we want our toys to teach children. Robert slid a document across the table. This is our initial offer. Please take some time to review it with your lawyer if you'd like. Harold looked down at the paper, and his breath caught in his throat. The licensing fee alone was $100, 000, The projected royalties over 5 years were estimated at between $250,000 and $500,000 depending on sales. And this is a joke, right? Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. No joke, Mr. Wilson, Robert said firmly. We're serious about this project, and we're prepared to invest significantly in it. We believe it has the potential to be one of our most successful lines yet. Harold's hands trembled as he set the paper down. The amount they were offering would not only save his farm from foreclosure, but would allow him to upgrade his equipment, repair his buildings, and perhaps even expand his operation. It was a lifeline he had never expected, appearing just when he needed it most. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Claire reached across the table and patted his hand. You don't have to decide right now. Take a few days to think about it. We're staying at Jacob's aunt's house in town until Sunday. Robert handed him a business card. My cell number is on there. Call me anytime if you have questions. They stayed for another half hour, discussing the general concept for the toy line and how the process would work. Harold listened, still somewhat in shock, as they described photo shoots, interviews, and possible promotional events. The whole thing seemed surreal, like a dream he might wake from at any moment. When they finally left, promising to check back in a couple of days, Harold remained on the porch, staring at the contract and business card in his hands. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a beautiful end to the most unexpected day of his life. Inside, Harold placed the contract carefully on the kitchen table, right next to the bank's foreclosure notice. The juxtaposition was almost poetic. His salvation had come not from his decades of hard work on the land, but from a simple act of kindness toward a child. Harold barely slept that night. His mind kept replaying the conversation with the Matthews couple, analyzing it from every angle, looking for the catch, the hidden trap, but there didn't seem to be one. They wanted to pay him a small fortune for the right to model a toy after his struggling farm, and to tell the story of how he'd fixed their son's tractor. It was absurd. And yet it was happening. By morning, Harold had made his decision. He would accept their offer. Not just for the money, though God knew he needed it, but because something about the project resonated with him. The idea that his farm, his way of life, might help urban children understand where their food came from, and the values of rural communities felt important, especially in a world that seemed increasingly disconnected from its agricultural roots. After completing his morning chores, Harold drove into town, something he rarely did more than once a week, to save on gas. He headed straight to the small law office on Main Street. Frank Garrison had been handling the Wilson family's legal matters for 30 years, ever since taking over the practice from his father. Frank's secretary, Mrs. Pemberton, looked up in surprise when Harold walked in. Harold Wilson, twice in 1 month? The world must be ending. Her tone was teasing but kind. Need to see Frank if he's available, Harold said, the contract burning a hole in his pocket. It's important. 20 minutes later, Harold sat across from Frank in his cluttered office, watching as the lawyer examined the contract, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. And you say they just showed up at your farm? Frank asked, not looking up from the document. The CEO of Magi Toys and his wife? That's right, Harold confirmed. Their boy was staying with his aunt in town. I fixed his toy tractor yesterday, and next thing I know, his parents are offering me this deal. Frank whistled low. Well, I've read some strange contracts in my day, but this might be the most straightforward. They're offering you a significant amount of money for very little obligation on your part. He flipped to the next page. They want rights to photograph your farm, use your name and likeness in their promotional materials, and potentially have you participate in a few events to launch the toy line. And it's legitimate? There's no catch? Frank removed his reading glasses and looked at Harold directly. From what I can see, it's entirely legitimate. Magi Toys is a publicly traded company with an excellent reputation. This licensing fee is substantial but not outlandish for a company of their size. He tapped the contract. I'd like to make a few small amendments to protect your interests, but overall, Harold, I'd say you've stumbled into an extraordinary opportunity. Relief washed over Harold. So I should accept? Unless you have some objection to having a toy based on your farm, I don't see why you wouldn't. Frank studied him curiously. Do you have concerns about the publicity? It would mean some changes to your rather private lifestyle. Harold considered this. He had always valued his solitude, particularly since Margaret's passing. The idea of photographers coming to the farm, of possibly appearing in promotional materials or at events, was intimidating. But when weighed against losing the farm entirely, the choice was clear. "I'll manage," he said simply. Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken calculation. "I'll make these amendments and have Mrs. Pemberton type them up. You can pick up the revised contract tomorrow morning. In the meantime, you might want to call Mr. Matthews and let him know you're interested but waiting on legal review." Harold did just that, using the phone in Frank's office since his ancient flip phone had died months ago, and he hadn't bothered to replace it. Robert Matthews answered on the second ring, sounding genuinely pleased to hear from Harold. He readily agreed to the legal review, and even expressed appreciation for Harold's diligence. "We respect that you're taking this seriously," Robert said. "It shows the kind of careful consideration we admire. Take all the time you need." The next morning, Harold returned to Frank's office, reviewed the minor changes, and signed the amended contract. Frank offered to fax it to the number Robert had provided, and by noon, Harold had received confirmation that the Matthews had countersigned the agreement. The deal was official. What followed was a whirlwind unlike anything Harold had experienced before. True to their word, the Matthews arranged for a photographer to visit the farm the following week. The woman, a freelance professional named Sophia who had worked with Magi Toys on several projects, arrived with an assistant and a car full of equipment. Harold had spent the intervening days cleaning up the farmhouse and yard as best he could, even going so far as to paint the front porch railings, which had been peeling for years. The farm would never look pristinette was a working operation, not a show piece, but he wanted it to present as well as possible. Sophia turned out to be a blessing. In her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and an easy manner, she immediately put Harold at ease. "We're not looking for perfection," she explained as they walked the property together. "We want authenticity. This is a real farm, and that's what makes it special." Over 2 days, she photographed every aspect of the operation: the fields, the barn, the tractors both functioning and not, the small herd of cattle, the chicken coop, and Harold himself working in various settings. She even convinced him to dig out some old photo albums, exclaiming with delight over pictures of Harold's father and grandfather working the same land decades earlier. "This is gold," she said, carefully photographing the faded images. "This multi-generational connection to the land is exactly the story Magi Toys wants to tell." By the time she left, Harold found he had actually enjoyed the experience. Sophia's genuine interest in his farm and its history had been flattering, and her assistant, a young man named Louis, had asked thoughtful questions about farming practices that revealed a sincere curiosity about, quote, agricultural life. 2 days after the photography session, the first installment of the licensing fee was deposited directly into Harold's bank account. He drove to the Mid-State Bank that same afternoon, walked up to the teller with more confidence than he'd felt in years, and requested to speak with the mortgage department. The young loan officer who had been handling his case, a woman named Melissa who had always been professionally sympathetic but ultimately bound by the bank's policies, couldn't hide her surprise when Harold handed her a cashier's check for the full amount of his outstanding mortgage payments, plus an additional 3 months in advance. "Mr. Wilson," she said, staring at the check, "this is unexpected." "Had some good fortune," Harold replied, not inclined to elaborate. "This squares us up?" Melissa nodded, clearly curious but too professional to pry. "Yes, this more than covers the outstanding balance. I'll process this immediately and update your account status. The foreclosure proceedings will be canceled, of course." "Appreciate it," Harold said, turning to leave. "Mr. Wilson," Melissa called after him. When he turned back, she smiled genuinely. "I'm really glad things worked out for you." Harold nodded his thanks and left. A weight lifted from his shoulders that had been pressing down for longer than he cared to remember. Outside in the parking lot, he allowed himself a moment of pure relief, taking a deep breath of the warm summer air that now felt fresher somehow. Over the next few weeks, Harold's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. With the immediate financial pressure relieved, he was able to make long-deferred repairs to his equipment. The irrigation system was finally functioning properly, and he hired a mechanic to overhaul his tractor, which now ran better than it had in a decade. Robert and Claire Matthews called regularly with updates on the toy line's development. They sent digital renderings of the proposed playset, seeking Harold's input on details and accuracy. To his surprise, Harold found himself genuinely engaged in the process, offering suggestions and corrections that the designers incorporated eagerly. "Your insights are invaluable," Claire told him during one call. "You're helping us create something truly authentic." In mid-August, the Matthews invited Harold to their company headquarters in Chicago to view the prototype of the Wilson family farm playset. Harold hadn't left Oak Ridge Valley in over 3 years, not since Margaret's funeral when they buried her in the small cemetery beside the white clapboard church in town. The prospect of traveling to a major city, staying in a hotel, and visiting a corporate office was intimidating to say the least. But curiosity won out over anxiety. Harold arranged for a neighbor's son, a responsible teenager named Kyle, to look after the farm for the 2 days he'd be gone. The Matthews had offered to send a car, but Harold insisted on driving himself to the regional airport an hour away. Some independence had to be maintained. The flight to Chicago was Harold's first time on an airplane in over 15 years. He sat stiffly in his seat, hands gripping the armrests during takeoff, only gradually relaxing as the flight progressed. A car was waiting for him at O'Hare Airport, the driver holding a sign with "Mr. Wilson" printed neatly on it. The hotel was more luxurious than any Harold had ever stayed in, with a view of Lake Michigan that made him pause in appreciation when he entered his room. The vastness of the water reminded him, oddly, of his fields when the corn was high and rippling in the breeze. Different, yet somehow familiar in its expanse. The next morning, the same car collected him for the drive to Magi Toys headquarters, a modern glass building in the downtown area. Harold felt distinctly out of place in his best flannel shirt and the only pair of dress pants he owned, which Margaret had insisted he buy for a cousin's wedding years ago. The pants were slightly loose now, his frame having grown leaner with age and work. The lobby of Magi Toys was a child's dream come to life. Colorful displays showcased their most popular toys, and a massive interactive play area occupied one corner, where children visiting with parents could test products while the adults conducted business. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted Harold by name. "Mr. Wilson, we've been expecting you. Mr. and Mrs. Matthews are ready for you in the design studio." She gestured to a young man in a company polo shirt. "Tyler will escort you up." Harold followed Tyler into an elevator with glass walls that looked out over the city as they ascended. The view was dizzying, the height more unsettling than inspiring to someone who had spent his life with his feet firmly planted on the ground. The doors opened onto a large open-plan space, filled with workstations where designers bent over drawings or worked at computers with large screens. Models and prototypes lined shelves along the walls, and in the center of the room was a large conference table where Robert and Claire Matthews waited. "Harold!" Robert called, coming forward to shake his hand warmly. "Thank you so much for making the journey. We're thrilled to have you here." Claire embraced him briefly, a gesture that caught Harold off guard, but wasn't unwelcome. "You look well," she said, studying his face. "Farm life agrees with you. Getting easier now that things are working properly again," Harold admitted. The influx of funds had allowed him to address long-standing issues that had been making his work unnecessarily difficult for years. "Come," Robert said, guiding him toward the conference table. "We have something special to show you." On the table sat a large model, covered with a cloth. Around it were boards with designs, photographs of Harold's farm Sophia's work. He recognized what appeared to be packaging mock-ups. "Ready?" Claire asked, her hand on the cloth. Harold nodded, unexpectedly nervous. Claire pulled away the cloth, to reveal a detailed miniature version of his farm. The farmhouse was there, a perfect tiny replica, down to the weather vane on the roof that Harold's father had installed in 1974. The barn, the fields, even the old oak tree by the driveway recreated in exquisite detail. Small figures represented farmers, animals, and visitors. One figure, Harold noted, with a lump in his throat, was clearly meant to be him, complete with his characteristic chambray work shirt and the battered straw hat he wore in summer. "This is the prototype for the Wilson family farm playset," Robert explained. "It will include the farm buildings, vehicles, animals, and figures, all designed for interactive play. Children can plant crops, care for animals, repair machinery, all the activities of real farm life." Harold stepped closer, examining the miniature version of his world. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even the tiny tractor had working parts, reminiscent of the one he repaired for Jacob. "And that's not all," Claire said, pulling forward one of the boards. It showed the cover of a children's book titled "The Kind Farmer and the Broken Tractor." The illustration depicted a white-haired farmer unmistakably, based on Harold helping a small boy with a toy. "The book tells the story of how you helped Jacob," Claire explained. "It's about kindness, the value of knowing how to fix things, and the importance of farming communities. Each playset will come with the book, introducing children to these values through your story." Harold was speechless. Seeing his life, his farm, transformed into this miniature world and story was overwhelming. It wasn't just a toy, it was a testament to a way of life that he had feared was being forgotten in the modern world. "What do you think?" Robert asked, watching Harold's face carefully. Harold cleared his throat, fighting an unexpected wave of emotion. It's something else. You've captured it just right." He pointed to the tiny barn. "Even the patched roof where the storm took off some shingles last year." Claire beamed. "We wanted it to be authentic. That's why your input has been so valuable." "There's one more thing," Robert said, his expression growing more serious. "We'd like to launch this product line with a special event. We were thinking of hosting it at your farm, if you're willing. A day where families could visit, learn about farming, and celebrate the launch of the Wilson family farm collection." Harold's initial instinct was to refuse. His farm was his sanctuary, his private world. The idea of opening it up to strangers, to families and children and media, was daunting. But as he looked at the model before him, at the care and respect with which his life's work had been represented, something shifted in his perspective. "When would this be?" he asked, not quite a yes, but no longer an automatic no. "We're thinking late September," Claire said. "The weather should still be good, and it's before harvest gets too busy for you. We'd handle all the logistics, of course. Set up tents, activities, refreshments. You would just need to be there as the guest of honor, and perhaps give a short talk about farming life." Harold considered this. September would indeed be before the most intense harvest work began. And there was something appealing about the idea of sharing his knowledge, of showing people, especially children, what farm life was really like beyond the romanticized or oversimplified versions they might have seen. "I think I could manage that," he said finally. The Matthews exchanged delighted glances. "Wonderful!" Robert exclaimed. "We'll start planning right away. This is going to be something really special, Harold." The rest of the day was spent in discussions about the launch event, the final details of the toy line, and the marketing campaign that would accompany it. Harold found himself drawn into conversations with designers and marketing specialists, his opinions sought and valued in a way that was entirely new to him. By the time he returned to his hotel that evening, Harold was exhausted but strangely invigorated. The project had taken on a dimension he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the money anymore, though that remained a crucial lifeline. It was about legacy, about sharing the farming tradition he had inherited and maintained through decades of struggle and joy. Looking out at the lake from his hotel window, Harold thought about Margaret, wishing she could see what was happening. She had always been the more social of the two of them, the one who maintained connections with neighbors and friends, even as Harold retreated further into his work and solitude after her death. She would have loved this, he thought. The idea of children playing with a toy based on their farm, learning about the life they had built together. For the first time in years, Harold felt a sense of purpose beyond the day-to-day work of keeping the farm running. He was part of something larger, something that might outlast him and carry forward the values he had lived by. It was an unexpected gift, born from a simple act of kindness toward a child with a broken toy. The next morning, before his flight home, Harold had breakfast with Robert and Claire in the hotel restaurant. They discussed the next steps and timeline for the project. The official launch was scheduled for September 28th, just over a month away. In the meantime, final production of the toy sets would begin, marketing materials would be prepared, and arrangements for the farm event would get underway. "We'll send a team to visit the farm next week to start planning the logistics," Claire explained. "They'll need to assess the space, determine where to set up tents and activities, that sort of thing." Harold nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening, but committed now to seeing it through. "Just let me know when they're coming, and I'll make sure everything's ready." Robert handed him a folder. "These are copies of all the materials we showed you yesterday, plus the finalized contract for the launch event. Frank has already reviewed it, as you requested." Harold appreciated that they had respected his wish to have his lawyer look over everything, even though the Matthews had proven themselves trustworthy. Old habits of caution died hard. "One more thing," Claire said, her expression thoughtful. "We've been thinking about expanding this initiative beyond just the toy line and book. There's an opportunity here to create a broader educational program about farming and rural life for schools." Robert nodded enthusiastically. "We've had preliminary discussions with some educational consultants. The idea would be to develop classroom materials that use the Wilson family farm as a starting point to teach children about agriculture, sustainability, the food supply chain, all those critical topics that often get overlooked in standard curricula." End quote. Harold raised his eyebrows. "You think teachers would be interested in that?" "Very much so," Claire assured him. "There's a growing recognition of the disconnect between children and an understanding of where their food comes from. Many kids, especially in urban areas, have never visited a farm or garden. They don't understand the processes that bring food to their tables." End quote. "We'd like to include video content in these educational materials," Robert added. "Short segments showing real farm work through the seasons. With your permission, of course, we'd like to film some of this at your farm, with you demonstrating and explaining various aspects of the work." Harold considered this. The idea of being filmed, of becoming a kind of teacher to children he would never meet, was another step outside his comfort zone. But he couldn't deny the value in what they were proposing. How many times had he complained to Margaret about how disconnected people had become from the realities of food production? How many times had he read news articles about children who didn't know that milk came from cows, or that potatoes grew underground? "I'm not much of a performer," he said hesitantly. "Not sure I'd be any good on camera." Claire smiled warmly. "From what we've seen, Harold, you're authentic and knowledgeable. That's worth more than any polished performance." Children respond to sincerity. They can tell when someone is speaking from real experience and passion. Put that way, it was hard to argue. "Well, I suppose we could give it a try," Harold conceded. "Can't promise I'll be any good at it, but I'm willing to try." "That's all we can ask," Robert said, clearly pleased. "We'll include initial filming during the launch event, capture some of the interactions with visitors. If all goes well, we can schedule more focused sessions later." As they parted ways at the hotel entrance, Claire impulsively hugged Harold again. "Thank you," she said earnestly, "not just for agreeing to all this, but for what you did for Jacob. You've reminded us of something important, something we try to instill in our products but sometimes lose sight of in the corporate world, that the simplest acts of kindness can have the most profound impact." Harold, uncomfortable with such direct appreciation but touched nonetheless, merely nodded. "Just did what anyone would do." "But that's just it," Robert said, shaking his hand firmly. "Not everyone would. That's why this story matters." The flight home gave Harold time to reflect on the whirlwind his life had become. Just weeks ago, he had been facing the loss of his farm, the end of his family's legacy, and a future of uncertainty. Now, he had financial security, a renewed sense of purpose, and a platform to share the farming tradition he valued so deeply. All because he had taken the time to fix a child's toy tractor. The universe worked in mysterious ways, Margaret would have said. She had believed in a certain cosmic balance. That kindness generated kindness in return, though rarely in the ways one might expect. Harold had always been more pragmatic, but he had to admit that the events of the past month seemed to support her view. Back at the Bunna farm, everything was as he had left it. Kyle having done a competent job of maintaining things during Harold's absence. The familiar surroundings felt both unchanged and somehow different, as if Harold was seeing them through new eyes. His farm was no longer just his private domain, but would soon become a symbol, a representation of rural values for children across the country. The promised team from Crom, Magi Toys, arrived 3 days later. A group of 4 efficient professionals led by an event planner named Diane, who had organized launches for the company's major product lines for over a decade. They walked the property with Harold, taking measurements, making notes, and discussing potential layouts for the event. "We're expecting around 200 people," Diane explained. "Mostly families with children, some media, key retailers, and educational partners. We'll set up the main tent here." She indicated the flat area near the barn, with smaller activity stations throughout the property. "Everything will be clearly marked and staffed, so guests won't wander into work areas." Harold listened, occasionally offering suggestions based on his knowledge of the land. "That area tends to get muddy if there's been any rain," he pointed out as Diane considered a spot for a children's activity. "Might want to move it closer to the drive where the ground's more solid." Diane nodded appreciatively. "Exactly the kind of insight we need, thank you." By the end of the day, a comprehensive plan had been developed. The event would run from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., with the official unveiling of the Wilson family farm collection at noon. Various activities would be offered throughout the day: demonstrations of farm equipment, interaction with animals, planting workshops, and storytelling sessions featuring the new book. Harold would give a brief talk about farming life during the unveiling, and later participate in a Q session with visitors. "We'll handle all the setup and cleanup," Diane assured him. "And we'll have plenty of staff on hand to manage everything. You won't need to worry about the logistics." After the team left, Harold stood in his yard, trying to visualize the transformation that would take place. Tents, displays, activities. Hundreds of people. His quiet farm would become a bustling hub of activity for a day. The thought was both exciting and intimidating. That evening, he received a call from Jacob's aunt, Jenny. "Harold? It's Jenny Matthews, Jacob's aunt. I hope you don't mind me calling. Robert gave me your number." "Not at all," Harold replied, surprised but pleased. "How's Jacob doing?" "He's wonderful. Actually, that's why I'm calling. He's going back home to Chicago tomorrow, and he was hoping to stop by and say goodbye. He's been telling everyone in town about the kind farmer who fixed his tractor." Harold smiled at the thought. "I'd like that. Tell him he's welcome any time tomorrow." "Great. How about around 10 in the morning? I need to drive him to the airport by noon." 10 works fine." The next morning, Harold found himself looking forward to Jacob's visit. He had grown fond of the boy during their brief interactions. Appreciating his enthusiasm and genuine interest in the farm, Jenny's car pulled up precisely at 10. Jacob bounded out, clutching his toy tractor, followed more sedately by his parents. Harold was surprised to see Robert and Claire, having assumed they had already returned to Chicago. "Hope you don't mind us tagging along," Robert said as they approached the porch where Harold waited. "We wanted to see the farm one more time before the big event." "Not at all," Harold replied, though he did feel a twinge of self-consciousness about the modest state of his home compared to the luxury he had glimpsed in their lives. Jacob held up his tractor proudly. "I've been super careful with it, Mr. Wilson. It works perfect still." Harold crouched down to the boy's level, examining the toy. "You can take good care of it. That's important with machinery, you know. Regular maintenance prevents bigger problems down the road." Jacob nodded solemnly, absorbing this wisdom. "Dad says the toy they're making is going to have your farm and you in it. Is that true?" "Looks that way," Harold confirmed. though I'm not sure why anyone would want a toy version of me. Because you're kind, Jacob said simply. And you know how to fix things. That's important. From the mouths of babes, as Margaret would have said, Harold felt that now familiar lump in his throat. Well, thank you, Jacob. That's a mighty fine compliment. Could you show me your real tractor before we go? Jacob asked hopefully. The big one? Harold glanced at Robert and Claire, who nodded their permission. Sure thing. It's in the barn. Not as shiny as your toy one, but it gets the job done. He led them to the barn where his recently repaired John Deere stood. It was indeed not shiny. Decades of use had dulled its original gleam, but it was clean and well-maintained, especially since the recent overhaul. Jacob's eyes widened at the sight of the massive machine. It's huge. Can I sit in it? If your parents say it's okay, Harold said. With permission granted, Harold lifted Jacob into the driver's seat, showing him the steering wheel, the gear shift, and various controls. The boy listened with rapt attention, asking surprisingly thoughtful questions about how the tractor worked and what each part did. You've got a natural curiosity about machines, Harold observed. That's a good quality. He gets that from his grandfather, Claire said. My father was a mechanical engineer. Could fix anything with moving parts. A useful skill, Harold said. Too many people these days just throw things away when they break, instead of trying to fix them. Robert nodded. That's actually part of what we're trying to address with our educational initiative. Teaching children the value of repair and maintenance, not just with toys, but as a life philosophy. The visit continued with a brief tour of the rest of the farm. Jacob was particularly fascinated by the chickens, laughing delightedly when they clustered around him, hoping for feed. All too soon, Jenny reminded them of the time, and they needed to leave for the airport. As they said their goodbyes, Jacob surprised Harold with a hug. Thank you for fixing my tractor and showing me your farm, he said, his face serious. I'm going to tell all my friends about it. You're welcome any time, Jacob, Harold replied, meaning it. Maybe you can come back for the big event next month. We'll definitely be here, Robert assured him. Jacob wouldn't miss it for the world. After they left, Harold returned to his daily work with a lighter heart than he'd had in years. The boy's genuine enthusiasm had been a reminder of the simple joys that had drawn Harold to farming in the first place, joys that had sometimes been obscured by financial worries and the relentless demands of keeping the supply operation afloat. The weeks leading up to the launch event passed in a blur of preparation. True to their word, the Magi Toys team handled most of the logistics, but there was still plenty for Harold to do. He repainted the barn doors, repaired fencing, and generally spruced up the property in ways he had neglected during the leaner years. Local interest in the event grew as word spread. The Oak Ridge Valley Gazette ran a front-page story about the Wilson family farm toy line, complete with an interview in which Harold awkwardly tried to explain the serendipitous chain of events that had led to this unlikely partnership with a major corporation. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Harold in years now stopped him in the feed store or diner to express their amazement and congratulations. Always knew that farm of yours was special, old Joe Hendricks said one morning at the local coffee shop, clapping Harold on the shoulder. Just took some city folks to recognize it. Harold accepted the congratulations with characteristic modesty, still uncomfortable with the attention but gradually adjusting to his new status in the community. Several local farmers even approached him about allowing their children or grandchildren to attend the event, which Magi Toys readily agreed to, seeing it as an opportunity to include the local community. 3 days before the event, a convoy of trucks arrived at the farm carrying tents, tables, displays, and all the materials needed for the launch. A crew of workers began the setup process, transforming Harold's property with efficient precision. Diane oversaw every detail, occasionally consulting with Harold about placement or access points, but generally handling everything with minimal disruption to his daily routine. By the evening before the event, the transformation was complete. A large white tent stood in the field near the barn. Smaller canopies dotted the property housing various activity stations, and professionally designed signs directed visitors along carefully planned paths. Display cases containing the Wilson family farm playsets were arranged inside the main tent, along with posters showing the educational materials and book. Harold walked the grounds after the crew had left for the day, taking in the surreal sight of his farm turned into a corporate event space. Yet, despite the marketing elements and branded displays, there was an authenticity to it all that he appreciated. The Magi Toys team had made a genuine effort to represent farming accurately, to respect the realities of agricultural life, rather than presenting a sanitized or romanticized version. Inside the main tent, Harold paused before the centerpiece display, the Wilson family farm playset, now in its final production form. The attention to detail remained impressive. His farmhouse, his barn, his equipment all recreated in miniature with remarkable accuracy. And there was the figure representing him, positioned beside a tiny version of the workshop where he had repaired Jacob's tractor. Beside the display stood a poster showing the cover of The Kind Farmer and the Broken Tractor. The illustration depicted Harold and Jacob sitting on the porch steps, the toy tractor between them. The artist had captured something ineffable in the immediate connection between generations, the passing of knowledge, the simple human bond formed through an act of kindness. Harold felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Margaret would have loved this, he thought again. She had always believed in the importance of stories, in their power to teach and connect. Now their farm, their life's work, had become a story that would reach children they would never meet, perhaps planting seeds of understanding and appreciation for a way of life that was increasingly foreign to many. The day of the event dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. Harold was up before sunrise, as always, completing his essential chores before the visitors arrived. By 8 o'clock, the Magi Toys team was on site, making final preparations. Diane found Harold in the barn, going over his notes for the short speech he was expected to give. "Nervous?" she asked sympathetically. Harold nodded, not bothering to deny it. "Never been one for public speaking." "You'll do fine," she assured him. "Just speak from the heart. That's what people want to hear." By 9:30, the first vehicles were pulling up to the temporary parking area set up in the eastern field. Harold watched from his porch as families emerged, children running ahead excitedly, while parents followed at a more sedate pace. Magi Toys staff greeted them, distributing welcome packets and directing them toward the various activities. At 10 o'clock precisely, Robert and Claire Matthews arrived with Jacob between them. They made their way directly to Harold's porch, Jacob running ahead just as he had on his first visit. "Mr. Wilson," the boy called. "It looks amazing. Like a fair, but on your farm." Harold smiled, Jacob's enthusiasm infectious. "It's something else, isn't it? Hardly recognize the place myself." Robert shook Harold's hand warmly. "The turnout is incredible. We've got media from 3 states, representatives from major retailers, educational consultants, and of course families eager to see the new collection. And to meet the man who inspired it all," Claire added, giving Harold an encouraging smile. "Ready for your big moment?" Harold adjusted the collar of his new shirt, one of several items of clothing he had purchased for the occasion, his first new garments in years. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." They joined the growing crowd in and around the main tent. Harold was introduced to various Magi Toys, executives, retail buyers, and media representatives. He answered questions as best he could, gradually becoming more comfortable with the attention as the morning progressed. At noon, Diane guided Harold to the small stage that had been set up at one end of the main tent. The crowd gathered, a sea of faces turned expectantly toward him. Harold felt a moment of panic, but then he spotted Jacob in the front row, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. Somehow, that simple gesture steadied him. Robert stepped up to the microphone first, welcoming everyone and providing a brief overview of the Wilson family farm collection. He spoke about the company's commitment to educational toys that taught children about different lifestyles and professions, and the importance of connecting urban children with an understanding of where their food came from. "But this particular project is special," Robert continued, "because it was born not from a marketing strategy or focus group, but from a genuine human connection. A simple act of kindness that reminded us of the values we want to instill in children through our products." He then introduced Claire, who spoke about the educational initiative that would accompany the toy line. "The Wilson Family Farm Collection isn't just a toy," she explained. "It's a gateway to learning about agriculture, sustainability, community, and the value of skills like repair and maintenance. The accompanying book and educational materials will be available to schools nationwide, helping teachers bring these important topics into their classrooms." Finally, it was Harold's turn. He approached the microphone with trepidation, clutching his notes tightly. The crowd applauded warmly, encouraging him. Harold cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of faces. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "Been farming this land for over 40 years, and most days, the only creatures listening to me are the cattle and chickens." A ripple of appreciative laughter ran through the audience, easing Harold's nerves. "When Jacob Matthews showed up at my fence with a broken toy tractor, I didn't think twice about helping him. That's just what neighbors do. My father taught me that, and his father taught him. Out here, we look after each other, because sometimes that's all we've got." Harold glanced down at his notes, then set them aside. The words he had carefully prepared suddenly seemed unnecessary. "Farming isn't always easy. Nature doesn't care about your plans or your profit margins. Some years the rain comes just right, other years not at all. Prices fluctuate, equipment breaks down, and there are days when you wonder why you keep at it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But then there are moments watching a crop you planted push up through the soil, seeing a calf take its first wobbly steps, or just sitting on the porch at sunset with the day's work done that remind you why this life matters. It connects you to something bigger than yourself, to the land, to the seasons, to the cycle of growth and harvest that's been going on since the beginning of time." End quote. Harold looked out at the children in the audience, their faces attentive and curious. "I never expected my farm to become a toy or my story to become a book. But if it helps children understand where their food comes from, if it teaches them the value of fixing things instead of throwing them away, if it shows them that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact, well, I reckon that's a crop worth sowing." The applause that followed was thunderous. Harold stepped back, slightly dazed by the response. Robert returned to the microphone, thanking Harold and inviting everyone to view the official unveiling of the Wilson Family Farm Collection. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of activities. Harold participated in demonstrations, answered questions during the scheduled Q session, and even found himself signing copies of The Kind Farmer and The Broken Tractor. That had been produced in a limited edition for the event. Children were everywhere, playing with the farm playsets that had been set up for them to explore, participating in planting workshops where they learned to start seeds in small pots they could take home, and interacting with the farm animals that had been cordoned off in a petting area. By late afternoon, Harold was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. The event had gone even better than the Magi Toys team had hoped. Preliminary feedback from retailers was enthusiastic, media coverage was extensive, and the educational partners were eager to incorporate the materials into their programs. As the event wound down and visitors began to depart, Harold found a quiet moment to sit on his porch steps, watching the activity from a slight distance. Robert spotted him and came over, settling beside him with a contented sigh. "You were a hit," Robert said, grinning. "A natural." Harold snorted skeptically. "Don't know about that, but I'm glad it went well for your company." "It's not just good for the company, Harold. It's good for the children who will learn from this, for the teachers who will have new tools to explain important concepts, and for farming communities that will gain more understanding and support from urban populations." Robert looked out over the farm, his expression thoughtful. "And I hope it's good for you too, beyond the financial aspects." Harold considered this. The day had been overwhelming but also deeply satisfying in a way he hadn't anticipated. Seeing children's eyes light up as they learned about farming, hearing their thoughtful questions, watching them engage with a lifestyle so different from their own, it had been a reminder of why his work mattered. "I think Margaret would have approved," he said finally. "She always said I needed to get out more, talk to people, share what we were doing here." Robert smiled. "She sounds like a wise woman." "The wisest," Harold agreed. "Wish she could have seen all this." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last visitors made their way to the parking area. The cleanup crew had already begun dismantling some of the smaller displays, working efficiently to restore the farm to its normal state. "What happens now?" Harold asked. "The collection launches nationwide next week," Robert explained. "The educational materials roll out to schools beginning in October. And if all goes as well as we expect, we'll start planning for next year's expansion of the line." "Expansion?" Robert nodded. "We're thinking seasonal sets showing the farm through spring planting, summer growth, fall harvest, and winter maintenance, each with new educational components and activities." The idea of this project continuing, evolving, growing beyond the initial concept was both surprising and gratifying. Harold's farm, his life's work, would continue to teach and inspire long after this single event. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, the Matthews family prepared to leave. Jacob ran up to Harold one last time, giving him another of his enthusiastic hugs. "This was the best day ever," the boy declared. "All my friends want Wilson family farm playsets now. I told them I know the real Mr. Wilson, and he's even nicer than in the book." Harold ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "You come back and visit any time, Jacob. There's always something new to see on a farm." Claire embraced Harold warmly. "Thank you for everything. This is just the beginning of something truly special." Robert shook his hand firmly. "We'll be in touch soon about next steps. And remember, if the publicity ever gets overwhelming, or you need anything at all, just call. You're part of the Magi Toys family now." After they left, Harold remained on his porch as darkness fell and the last of the event crew packed up and departed. The farm was quiet again, returned mostly to its usual state, though evidence of the day's activities remained in the flattened grass and occasional forgotten item. Harold felt a profound sense of transition. His life had changed irrevocably in the fast span of a few short weeks, all because he had taken the time to help a child with a broken toy. The financial windfall had saved his farm, but the unexpected sense of purpose and connection that had come with it felt equally valuable. Inside the Bia house, Harold noticed a package on the kitchen table that hadn't been there earlier. A note attached read, "The very first production model of the Wilson family farm playset. We thought you should have it. With gratitude, Robert and Claire." Harold opened the box carefully. Inside was the completed toy set, packaged as it would appear in stores across the country. His farm, his life, transformed into an educational toy that would find its way into countless children's hands. Alongside it was a hardcover copy of The Kind Farmer and the Broken Tractor. The illustrations bright and engaging. He sat at the kitchen table, turning the pages of the book slowly. The story was simplified, of course, but it captured the essence of what had happened. The final illustration showed the farmer him standing proudly beside his barn, surrounded by children learning about farm life, with the boy and his repaired tractor in the foreground. The accompanying text read, "And so, one small act of kindness grew into something much bigger, teaching children everywhere about the importance of farming, the value of fixing things, and how a helping hand can make all the difference in the world." Harold closed the book, oddly moved. Margaret had always told him that the measure of a life was not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away: your time, your knowledge, your kindness. He had never expected a simple act of helping a child would lead to all this, but perhaps that was the point. The most meaningful acts were often those done without expectation of return. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, a sound as familiar to Harold as his own heartbeat. The crops would welcome the moisture, the earth absorbing and transforming it into growth. Tomorrow, he would return to his regular routine, checking irrigation, tending animals, monitoring crops, but something fundamental had shifted. His work was no longer just about survival or maintaining a family legacy. It had taken on a new dimension, becoming part of a larger story that would outlive him. Harold Wilson, the farmer who had fixed a boy's toy tractor and unwittingly changed the course of his own life, sat in his kitchen listening to the rain and feeling, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. doing exactly what he was meant to do. In the months that followed, the Wilson family farm collection exceeded even Magi Toys' optimistic projections. The playset became one of the holiday season's most sought after toys, with retailers struggling to keep it in stock. The accompanying book reached the children's bestseller list, and the educational materials were adopted by school districts across the country. Harold adjusted to his new status gradually. The occasional interview request or visit from media was handled with increasing comfort, though he never lost his fundamental modesty. The royalty checks arrived regularly, allowing him to make long-deferred improvements to the farm, and even hire some part-time help for the first time in over a decade. More meaningful to Harold than the financial success, however, were the letters that began arriving from children who had received the playset or read the book. With Robert and Claire's encouragement, Magi Toys had included a mailing address where children could write to Mr. Wilson. The letters, often accompanied by drawings or photographs, expressed curiosity about farming, pride in fixing broken toys or other items, and sometimes simply gratitude for inspiring them to learn about where their food came from. Harold found himself sitting at the kitchen table each evening, carefully reading each letter, and, increasingly, writing back. His responses were simple and direct, but heartfelt, answering questions about crop cycles or animal care, offering encouragement for budding young fixers, and expressing appreciation for their interest in farming bird life. When winter arrived, bringing its customary slowdown in farm activity, Harold accepted Robert and Claire's invitation to participate in a limited promotional tour. Over 2 weeks in February, he visited 5 major cities, appearing at toy stores, schools, and children's museums. To his surprise, Harold found he enjoyed these events, particularly the school visits where children's unfiltered questions and observations often made him chuckle. "Do you have a pet cow?" one kindergartner asked solemnly. "How do you fix a tractor that's bigger than your house?" wondered another. "My dad says farming is hard work. Are you strong?" a little girl inquired, looking at his weathered hands with awe. Harold answered each question with patience and often humor, gradually becoming more comfortable in his unexpected role as an ambassador for agricultural life. The authenticity that had initially drawn the Matthews to him remained his greatest strength. He spoke simply and honestly about the challenges and rewards of farming, never romanticizing or oversimplifying. During the Chicago stop of the tour, Jacob and his parents hosted Harold for dinner at their home, a spacious but surprisingly comfortable apartment overlooking the lake. Jacob proudly showed Harold his expanded toy collection, which now included not just the repaired tractor that had started it all, but the complete Wilson family farm playset prominently displayed on a special shelf. "I told all my friends at school that I know the real Mr. Wilson," Jacob informed him. "My teacher didn't believe me until Mom showed her the pictures from the farm event." Harold found himself warming to the boy more with each interaction. There was an earnestness to Jacob, a genuine curiosity about the world that reminded Harold of himself at that age, before life's complications had made him more guarded. Later that evening, after Jacob had gone to bed, Robert shared news that took Harold by surprise. "The educational component of the Wilson Family Farm Initiative has attracted attention beyond what we anticipated," he explained, pouring Harold another cup of coffee. "We've been approached by a major public television network about developing a children's program based on the concept." Harold nearly choked on his coffee. "A TV show? About my farm?" Claire nodded enthusiastically. "Not exactly your specific farm, but a program that would use the Wilson family farm as a framework to teach children about agriculture, sustainability, where food comes from, all those topics. It would include animated segments, field trips to real farms around the country, and demonstration segments." "And they want me to be involved in this?" Harold asked incredulously. "In a limited capacity," Robert clarified. "Perhaps introducing segments or occasionally demonstrating simple farming tasks or repairs. The show would have regular hosts with television experience. But they feel your authentic presence would add credibility and connection to the real farming community." End quote. Harold shook his head in amazement. "When I fixed that toy tractor, I never imagined it would lead to all this." "That's precisely why it has," Claire said softly. Because you acted without calculation or expectation of return. In today's world, that kind of genuine kindness stands out. Harold considered the proposal carefully. A television show seemed far beyond anything he had ever envisioned for himself, yet the educational purpose aligned with what had come to matter to him throughout this unexpected journey. Sharing knowledge about farming with children who might otherwise grow up disconnected from the source of their food. I'll need to think about it, he said finally. It's a big step. Of course, Robert agreed. There's no rush. The network is still in the early planning stages. Just something to consider. By the time Harold returned to the farm in late February, signs of early spring were beginning to appear. The days were lengthening, and though frost still covered the ground most mornings, there was a subtle shift in the air that farmers recognized as the prelude to the growing season. Kyle, the neighbor's son who had helped during Harold's absence, had kept everything in good order. The young man had shown both interest and aptitude for farm work, and Harold was considering offering him a permanent part-time position. The royalty income from the toy line made it financially feasible, and Harold had to admit that at 58, some tasks were becoming more physically demanding than they once had been. One sunny March morning, as Harold was repairing a section of fence that winter storms had damaged, a familiar car appeared on the road leading to his property. It was Jenny Matthews' sedan, and as it drew closer, Harold could see Jacob's excited face pressed against the passenger window. Jenny waved as she parked, and Jacob tumbled out of the car almost before it had stopped, racing toward Harold with the now familiar enthusiasm that seemed to be his default state. "Mr. Wilson, guess what? We're moving here for the whole summer," the boy announced breathlessly. "Mom and Dad are coming too, but they're still in Chicago getting things ready. Aunt Jenny said I could come early because school's out for spring break." Harold looked questioningly at Jenny, who was approaching at a more sedate pace. "It's true," she confirmed. "Robert and Claire have rented the old Peterson place just outside town for the summer. They're working remotely on developing the educational television project, and they thought it would be good for Jacob to experience more of rural life firsthand." "That's quite a commitment," Harold observed, surprised that the busy executives would relocate, even temporarily, to Oak Ridge Valley. Jenny nodded. "They're serious about the educational aspect of all this. They want to understand farm life more deeply themselves if they're going to represent it to children." Harold turned to Jacob, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "Well, young man, if you're going to be around all summer, maybe you'd like to learn a bit about real farm work?" Jacob's eyes widened. "Could I really help?" "I promise I'd be careful and do exactly what you say." Harold found himself smiling, the boy's enthusiasm infectious. "I think we could arrange something. Maybe start with collecting eggs from the chickens or helping to feed the calves." "Yes, I want to do all of it." Jacob spun in a circle, unable to contain his joy at the prospect. "He's been talking about nothing else since they decided to come for the summer," Jenny said, watching her nephew with affection. "Robert and Claire were hoping you might be open to Jacob spending some time here, learning from you. With supervision, of course." Harold considered this. He had grown comfortable with Jacob's presence during their previous interactions, and the idea of sharing his knowledge with a genuinely interested child was appealing. "I think that could be arranged. There's plenty a boy his age can learn without getting into anything dangerous." And so began what Harold would later refer to as the Summer of Regeneration. Robert and Claire arrived a week later, settling into the rented farmhouse with a minimum of fuss. Their presence in Oak Ridge Valley caused a stir at first, but the small community quickly adjusted to having a CEO and CCO of a major corporation in their midst, especially when it became clear that the Matthews family intended to participate fully in local life. Jacob began spending 3 mornings a week at Harold's farm, arriving with either Robert or Claire, who would often stay to observe and occasionally participate themselves. Harold started the boy with simple tasks, collecting eggs under supervision, feeding the smaller animals, helping to water the kitchen garden that Harold had expanded that spring. To Harold's surprise and pleasure, Jacob proved to be not just enthusiastic but genuinely capable, following instructions carefully and showing patience unusual for a child his age. His questions were thoughtful, and he seemed to genuinely absorb the information Harold shared about crop cycles, animal care, and the intricacies of maintaining a working farm. "He reminds me of you," Claire observed one morning, as they watched Jacob carefully inspecting a newly planted row of lettuce in the garden. "That same careful attention to detail, the way he studies things before acting." Harold felt oddly pleased by the comparison. "He's a good boy, got a natural curiosity about how things work." As spring gave way to summer, Jacob's responsibilities gradually increased. He learned to help with simple repairs, to identify common weeds in the fields, to recognize when fruit was ripe for picking. Harold found himself looking forward to the boys' visits, planning which new skill or knowledge to share next. Robert and Claire were equally engaged, though in different ways. Robert's interest tended toward the mechanical aspects of farming, the equipment, the irrigation systems, the structures. Claire was more drawn to the cycles of growth, the interconnection between plants, animals, weather, and human intervention. Both asked thoughtful questions and took copious notes for the educational projects they were developing. The television concept evolved over these summer months, shaped by their direct experiences on Harold's farm and conversations with other local farmers whom Harold had introduced them to. What had initially been envisioned as a relatively simple children's program grew into a more comprehensive concept, a multi-platform educational initiative that would include not just the television show, but also online resources, curriculum materials for schools, and community engagement programs. "We want to create something that doesn't just teach facts about farming," Claire explained one evening as they sat on Harold's porch after a long day. Jacob had fallen asleep on a blanket on the grass, exhausted from helping to repair a chicken coop. "We want to foster genuine connection between children and the sources of their food, to help them understand the complex web that sustains us all." Harold nodded, understanding more deeply now what drove the Matthews in their work. They weren't just toy makers or entertainment producers. They were educators at heart, using various media to reach children and shape their understanding of the world. By mid-July, a film crew arrived to capture footage for both the television pilot and updated promotional materials for the expanding Wilson Family Farm product line. Harold had grown sufficiently comfortable with media attention that he no longer stiffened when cameras were present, though he still preferred the quieter days, when it was just him, Jacob, and occasionally Robert or Claire. Working on the farm. The summer brought other changes to Harold's life as well. Kyle, the neighbor's son, had accepted the part-time position and was proving to be a reliable assistant. The additional help allowed Harold to focus more on improvements to the farm that had been deferred for years. Upgrading the irrigation system, repairing outbuildings, even beginning to reclaim some of the acreage he had previously been forced to leave fallow due to lack of resources. The Wilson Family Farm toy line continued to exceed expectations in the market. The educational materials were being adopted by schools nationwide, and the book had gone into its fourth printing. The financial security this provided was still somewhat surreal to Harold, who had spent so many years on the edge of bankruptcy. He handled the newfound wealth conservatively, investing most of it back into the farm or in secure accounts for the future, with Frank Garrison's guidance. One warm August evening, as Harold, Robert, Claire, and Jacob sat on the porch after a day of filming, Robert broached a subject that took Harold by surprise. "We've been thinking about the future of this initiative," he said, glancing at Claire, who nodded encouragingly. "The way it's growing, expanding into new areas, reaching more children and families." Harold nodded, wondering where this was heading. "We believe it needs a more formal structure," Robert continued. "A foundation, specifically focused on agricultural education, that could oversee and coordinate all these different components: the toy line, the books, the educational materials, the television program, and whatever might come next." "Makes sense," Harold agreed. "Keep everything organized under one roof, so to speak." "Exactly," Claire said. "And we'd like to name it the Wilson Family Farm Foundation." Harold blinked in surprise. "You want to keep using my name for all this?" "It's become the brand identity," Robert explained. "But more importantly, your story, your values, your knowledge, your approach to farming and life has become the heart of the entire initiative. It would seem wrong to call it anything else. Harold was momentarily speechless. The idea that his name, his family's legacy, would continue in this way was both overwhelming and deeply moving. "We'd want you to be involved, of course," Claire added. "As much or as little as you're comfortable with. Perhaps as an advisor or board member. Your practical knowledge would be invaluable as we develop new educational content." Harold looked out over his fields, golden in the setting sun. The land that had been in his family for generations, that he had struggled to maintain through countless challenges, was now not just secure, but had become the inspiration for something that would touch lives far beyond these boundaries. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Jacob, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Does this mean Mr. Wilson will stay part of everything forever?" Claire smiled at her son. "In a way, yes. The foundation will ensure that the values and knowledge Mr. Wilson has shared continue to reach children for many years to come." Jacob nodded, satisfied. "Good, because he knows important stuff that kids should learn." Harold felt a lump form in his throat at the boy's simple assessment. From the beginning, it had been Jacob's perspective, his appreciation for Harold's help with the broken tractor, his genuine interest in farm life, that had set everything in motion. As summer waned, and the Matthews family prepared to return to Chicago, a sense of melancholy settled over the farm. Jacob had become a fixture in Harold's daily routine, and the prospect of the boy's departure left an unexpected void. Harold had never had children of his own, had never experienced the particular joy of sharing knowledge with a young, eager mind. These past months had given him a taste of what that might have been like. On their last day at the farm, Jacob presented Harold with a gift, a carefully constructed scrapbook documenting their summer together. Each page featured photographs, drawings by Jacob, pressed leaves or flowers, and captions in the boy's careful handwriting. "When Mr. Wilson showed me how to fix the chicken coop. First time collecting eggs all by myself. Learning about corn and how it grows. Mom helped me put it together," Jacob explained as Harold turned to Nayak. The pages slowly. "So you won't forget our summer when we're back in Chicago?" "I couldn't forget if I tried," Harold assured him, touched by the gift. "This is mighty fine work, Jacob. I'll keep it right here on the coffee table so I can look at it often." Goodbye was emotional for everyone. Jacob hugged Harold tightly, promising to write letters and to return the following summer if his parents allowed. Claire embraced Harold as well, thanking him for his patience and generosity in sharing his knowledge and his farm with them. Robert shook Harold's hand firmly. "This isn't really goodbye, you know. The foundation work is just beginning, and we'll be in touch regularly. Plus, there's the television pilot to finish, the next phase of educational materials to develop." Harold nodded, appreciating the reminder that this relationship would continue, albeit in a different form. "I'll be here. Farm's not going anywhere." As the Matthews car disappeared down the driveway, Harold felt an odd mixture of sadness and fulfillment. The summer had changed him in ways he was still discovering, opening him to connections and possibilities he had long since stopped considering. The following months brought a steady stream of developments. The Wilson Family Farm Foundation was formally established, with Harold serving on the advisory board alongside educators, agricultural experts, and child development specialists. The television pilot was completed and received enthusiastic support from the network, leading to an order for a full season of episodes. Harold traveled to Chicago occasionally for foundation meetings or television production consultations, but mostly he remained on his farm, continuing the work that had defined his life, while adapting to his new role as an educational ambassador for agricultural life. The letters from children continued to arrive, and Harold maintained his practice of reading and responding to each one. A particular letter arrived in early December, nearly a year and a half after Jacob had first appeared at Harold's fence with his broken tractor. It was from a second-grade class in Seattle, accompanied by a package. Inside the package was a collection of handmade thank you cards, each expressing appreciation for the Wilson Family Farm educational materials that had become part of their classroom. The teacher's note explained that the class had been using the curriculum for a semester, and the children had been particularly inspired by the story of how Harold had helped Jacob. To honor your example, the teacher wrote, we started a fixing station in our classroom. Children bring in broken toys or other small items, and we work together to repair them instead of throwing them away. The children wanted you to know what an impact your best story has had on them. Harold spread the cards out on his kitchen table, reading each one carefully. The children's drawings and earnest messages brought tears to his eyes. One card in particular caught his attention. A little girl had drawn a picture of a farmer standing beside a child, both smiling. Inside, she had written, "Thank you for teaching us that fixing things is important. My dad and I fixed my bike together because of you. Now he fixes lots of things instead of buying new ones." The simplicity and power of the message struck Harold deeply. His impulsive act of kindness toward Jacob had rippled outward, touching lives he would never know, inspiring changes in behavior and perspective far beyond his farm. That evening, as snow began to fall gently outside, Harold sat on his porch wrapped in a warm coat, watching the white flakes transform his landscape. The farm was dormant now, resting through the winter months before spring would bring renewal and growth again. He thought about the journey of the past 18 months. From the moment Jacob had appeared with his broken tractor, to this present reality where Harold's name and farm had become symbols for values he had lived by without ever thinking they were special or noteworthy. The practical knowledge of how to fix things, the patience to work with the rhythms of nature rather than against them, the recognition that food doesn't simply appear in grocery stores, but is grown through human labor in partnership with the land. These were the lessons now reaching children across the country through books, toys, educational materials, and soon, a television program. Harold Wilson, the struggling farmer who had once faced foreclosure and the loss of his family legacy, had unwittingly become a teacher to thousands of children he would never meet. All because he had taken the time to help a boy with a broken toy tractor, never imagining that the boy's parents ran a billion-dollar toy brand, or that his simple act of kindness would spark a movement celebrating Gasha. Rural values around the world. As the snow continued to fall, Harold smiled to himself. Margaret had always told him that kindness was never wasted, that it always found its way back to you in unexpected forms. How right she had been. The next summer, Jacob returned as promised, bringing with him 3 friends whose parents had been convinced by the Matthews to let their children experience farm life firsthand. Harold welcomed them all, expanding his informal teaching to accommodate the additional curious minds. And so, a new tradition began. Each summer, the Wilson family farm hosted a small group of urban children for a month-long immersive experience in agricultural life. The program, sponsored by the foundation, was designed to give children not just an intellectual understanding of farming, but a tactile, sensory connection to the land and its rhythms. The television show, Wilson's Farm Adventures, debuted to strong ratings and critical acclaim, praised for its educational content and engaging presentation. Harold's role remained limited but significant, his authentic presence and practical knowledge providing a grounding reality to the more polished production elements. The toy line expanded to include seasonal sets, special editions, and educational supplements, all maintaining the core values of the original Wilson family farm collection. Schools across the country incorporated the curriculum materials, and community programs based on the foundation's model began to spring up, creating local connections between urban populations and their rural counterparts. Harold's farm itself transformed gradually, becoming both a working agricultural operation and an educational center. With the foundation's support, he built a small visitor center where school groups could learn about farming through interactive exhibits and direct observation. Kyle, once a part-time helper, became a full partner in the farm operations, bringing youthful energy and new ideas while respecting the traditions Harold had maintained. 3 years after fixing Jacob's tractor, Harold stood in his fields on a perfect summer day, watching a group of children from a Chicago public school excitedly identifying different crops under the guidance of one of the foundation's educators. Among them was Jacob, now 10 years old and serving as a kind of junior assistant, proudly sharing his own accumulated knowledge of farm life with the younger children. Robert and Claire stood nearby, observing with evident satisfaction. The initiative they had built around Harold's story had exceeded even their optimistic projections, reaching hundreds of thousands of children and families, bridging the growing gap between urban and rural Bath experiences. "Did you ever imagine it would grow like this?" Claire asked Harold as they watched the children. Harold shook his head. "Never in my wildest dreams. Just meant to fix a boy's toy. Turned out I was fixing a bit more than that, I guess." Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "You were fixing a disconnect, Harold, between generations, between urban and rural communities, between children and the source of their food, one small repair that led to many larger ones." Harold nodded, watching as Jacob patiently showed a young girl how to tell if a tomato was ripe for picking. There was something profoundly right about this cycle of knowledge being passed down, about the continuity represented in this simple moment. The struggling farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure had become a thriving operation, a community resource, and the inspiration for an educational movement. The lonely farmer who had rarely spoken to another person for weeks at a time was now surrounded by life, by learning, by connection. And it had all begun with a broken toy tractor and an act of kindness that Harold had performed without a second thought. Unaware that the boy's parents ran a billion-dollar toy brand, unaware that his simple repairs would ultimately fix far more than a child's plaything. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the fields in golden light, Harold Wilson stood amidst the crops his family had grown for generations, listening to the voices of children learning about the land, and felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His farm had found its purpose, not just in producing food, but in nurturing understanding, in connecting people to the earth and to each other. The legacy of the Wilson family farm would continue, not just in the furrows of this land, but in the minds and hearts of children who would carry its lessons forward into a future Harold would never see. And that, he reflected, was perhaps the most meaningful harvest of all.